Hi, welcome to our webinar. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Just a couple of admin things. Firstly, we'll be taking questions through the function on the webinar sign-in, and we'll also be live tweeting through at We Are Nomensa's Twitter feed, and you can we'll pick up questions through that as well. So Jon and I are here today to talk about our lessons, leadership, and the legacy that you can create bringing in service design and user-centered design processes into your work within the public sector. Jon, we've been working, Jon and I have been working together and separately in the public sector for a long time.
A while.
Yes, and most aptly in the last 6 years following the GDS framework and the great things that gov.uk and GDS have been doing. I'm a digital native working 20 years agency side, delivering all sorts of digital products and specializing within the public sector within Nomensa.
Okay, I'm Jon. I'm the head of user experience at Nomensa, and what that means is I lead a large team of practitioners here. That team can include service designers, user researchers, content specialists, designers, and all of the different flavors that make up a kind of modern digital delivery team. I've been working for about 17 years. Follow us on Twitter and all that jazz, really. You know, one of our specialisms have been, like Amanda said, in recent years, has been with following the GDS framework and delivering just excellent work within the public sector. And when we sat down, our webinar today is a talk that we gave last month in SD and Gov in Edinburgh. And what we intended to do is when we sat down, we thought, well, we could do a case study on one particular program of work. But what happens is myself and Amanda work very closely together, and we work across many projects and many different clients, and most importantly, I suppose, many different elements of the life cycle. So what we wanted to do was create a talk for you today, which effectively covers and spans across discoveries, alphas, beta, into live, but also is drawn upon lessons that we've learned across a massive range of public sector organizations. And this slide that we've put up here effectively shows just some of the examples that we're going to pull on. But everything that we're going to talk about today is kind of what we believe to be, I think we've got 8 lessons, don't we, Amanda? I think.
Yeah.
8 kind of common lessons that we see time and time again, no matter which public sector organization that we engage with. And then at the end of today, or about halfway through today's webinar, we end to kind of talk you through a framework which allows you to spot kind of some of the triggers or some of the patterns of behavior within project teams, which allow you to kind of get a feel for if your project is truly going to be a success or not.
Yeah. And also how you can maybe track cultural change and organizational change as you go through these processes and adopt it. We want to cover a small cross-section of lessons we've learned along the way and how these have led us to understand the legacy of that good service design can leave behind. This is far and away not a complete list, and we're looking at it particularly through a user-centered design lens.
Yeah. So we've got 8 lessons that we're going to go through, and 4 of them we group under what we call project lessons. And these are effectively things we see time and time again at a project level of things working or not working. So let's jump into it. You will never understand how complex our service is, said by basically every person on day one of every project we've ever worked on. You first come in, you meet the client, you meet the product owner or whomever is responsible or the delivery manager, and they are adamant that the complexity of the service is through the roof. And to be fair, they are right. You know, if things were simple, then you know, successful service design would be commonplace, which is starting to become. But I guess my point here is, if something is so easy to do, then everyone would do it. But what I'm trying to get at here is we often start from a position, or we see on projects people talking about job roles or personas, or what they perceive to be personas, which often fall into kind of maybe more of a marketing segmentation definition. So for those people who work within service design or within the user experience community, what we tend to see is actually, the number one lesson is you don't have as many users as you may think. And this is what I mean by that. So possibly one of the best examples of this was our work with the Met Office. And you might have seen this in some recent articles as well. Actually, the Met Office as a client doesn't have a very diverse, huge range of bespoke audience members. What they have is obviously members of the public who engage with the weather in a plethora of ways. So what we did in this project was try to approach the definition of their audience groups and their personas in a range of different contexts rather than individual audience groups and market segmentations per se. So here what you see is what we've just gone through is people who are preparing to do some kind of journey, and that's why they're inquiring about the weather. And on the left-hand side of the screen shows you where we conducted some of the user research in this example. And this really helped us work with the Met Office an example of defining your audience base through contexts rather than starting on day one of a project with, we have 24 different audience groups. So on the left you can see is we went to the Brecon Beacons and we spoke to mountain rescue teams who are using the weather in a certain context. We went to Glastonbury Tor and spoke to residents who live basically on floodplains, because what people don't realise is the Met Office have a safety critical nature to their work. And we also went to Bristol and Manchester and spoke to general members of the public. And what you then tend to see is the same groups of people looking for the same information but in different contexts and the priorities with which they give it. And we see this time and time again.
And we see it time again, and it's also a model that we take forward. So we've also used this recently for Highways England in applying contextualized, behavior-based personas rather than more individual. This is John, he's a commuter.
Here's a segmentation.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, and the second major pattern that we see, or second lesson that we see, and for those of you who've worked in service design for a while, you may well think, well, this is obvious, but we see it time and again, where the niche groups or the niche audiences, in some examples, are just hard to get to. And really what we're trying to get people is to break out of the lab mentality. There's a time and a place for lab-based research, but there's also a time and a place when trying to get access to these very particular groups. I'm thinking here like high court judges, actuaries, who if ever you've worked in the pensions industry, they don't get out of bed for £50 for your hour-long usability study.
It could be incredibly busy people within the healthcare service, which is a key area for us as well.
So just to give you some examples here, what you see is, the NHS, nobody in the NHS is sitting around with an hour or two to spare. It's a highly pressurized service within which often, you need to go to where they are. And on the right-hand side here, what you also see is one of our project leads here at Nomensa, Zoe Bierman, led an excellent piece of work where she effectively felt like a World War I general pushing toy soldiers around a map, as she planned where every member of her project team would be traveling to conduct ethnographic observations in the wild. And really this is kind of a common pattern where this is a lesson learned either from projects that are doing it really well or they're not doing it at all. And we feel it's important to call it out that sometimes some of those super niche audiences, the only way you're going to get hold of them is to go where they are. Yeah,
and we have come across that quite a bit in terms of going and talking to teams and saying, well, why can't we call them up, or why can't we do lab-based testing where they come to us? And then we talk about the value of doing a ride-along in an ambulance, or going to a call center to understand what sort of user issues are coming in through a different channel that isn't digital.
Okay, it's over to yourself, Amanda.
Yeah. It's funny for this one. John and I debated because Nomensa lives and breathes accessibility and inclusive design, and we have done since our inception. But we're still seeing in 2019 having to have conversations of why inclusive design, why considering people with access needs, assistive digital technology needs, even low digital skills or low reading ages need to be included in the services from the start. We're often seeing this at quite a late stage or very, very separate. So it's great when we come across organizations where they have champions internally, and if they don't, then we try to act as their champion where we can.
I think when we did this, champion's the key word for us, isn't it? Because it's the separation of accessibility into its own silo, which can hamper, in our opinion, the success of any accessibility actions that you may engage with.
And you know, accessibility is quite an easy one to slip into a box ticking exercise because you have a set of guidelines that is very clear cut whether you've met them or not. However, GDS is great at encouraging public sector services to go above and beyond the WCAG guidelines to include users at all stages of the testing. So not necessarily do testing with a discrete group of users with access needs, but include them in the research right from the beginning. And also to consider it as early as possible. Discovery is not unusual to start thinking about these users.
And so the last of the project lessons that we're going to talk about today, and remember each of these lessons we're presenting are, in our opinion, ones that we see on almost every project. Is we have to acknowledge that successful service design in government comes in all shapes and sizes, and most importantly, the elephant in the room that no one ever wants to talk about is budgets. But what you can still do something, irrespective of what your budget may be. If you have £5 or 5 million, there is always something that can be done, and this is the key message from ourselves. And if in doubt, though, bang for buck, from our experience, if you had to do one thing, it's content. And actually, time and time again, working with perhaps slightly smaller governmental organisations, we've seen that they've been able to do massive change without necessarily, you know, running off and worrying about their technology stack every time and time again. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying technology is bad or digital transformation is bad. My point here is that if in doubt, if you actually want to achieve some successful, meaningful change across the service, you can do a lot worse than change the content. It's
also sometimes the easiest thing to convince skeptical or risk-averse stakeholders to touch first.
So, I mean, this one here is just a case study, really, of where this happens. So the Rail Safety and Standards Board, back at the tail end of 2016, were looking to begin and commence a digital transformation program, but really we're operating at a level of wanting to win hearts and minds as well with the value of digital investment. And what basically the Rail Safety and Standards Board is a collection of incredibly technical content that can be hard for a novice user to engage with. So what we proposed to them was basically what we call the content pilot. And this was a relatively short, discrete piece of work which would focus down on one small area of their website, improve the content within that area, and help them disseminate it, and effectively almost like a micro content strategy to achieve value and demonstrate the success for their service.
And what it also did was join up a couple of diverse departments. So external comms and the digital team were working very separate and very siloed. And what this project did was brought them together to consider the full journey of content from creation through to publication on social media as well as the website.
Exactly, and to get cliche-tastic, wasn't it? We ended up kind of having two cliches here. One was how do you eat an elephant one piece at a time?
That was your favorite phrase.
That was my favorite phrase on this particular project. And what I mean by that is we wanted to, you know, also how do you feed, I'm all about food today. You know, that classic one about do you give someone a fish or do you teach them how to fish? And the point here is with the relatively smaller timescales and budgets that we were operating to, we took incredibly complex content and just focused down on the two topics that you see at the top there, which was health and well-being and the platform train interface. And the platform train interface is actually a really good example of an internal organization's terminology. For most people, you'd probably associate it as something like Mind the Gap, particularly obviously if you live in London. What I just want to show you this here is simply moving on what we gave them was the confidence to, once they'd demonstrated massive success with just focusing on 2 areas of their site's content, they now have the confidence to move forward, as you can see, to multiple other topics that their internal teams are able to confidently deliver.
And what this finally did for the client was convince some skeptical and risk-averse stakeholders right at the top to release budget for a more comprehensive CMS, so technical stack overhaul, and a new website, which is due to go live in the next week or 2.
And I think that's really important, right? Because the digital community, you go on Twitter and everyone will be shouting about digital transformation, and obviously it's important and there is a time and a place. But I think for us, what we were trying to get to was that not every organization, you have to acknowledge to do successful service design, that you need to move at the speed and the pace with which the organization needs to move. And actually, with this example here, some investment in content and content alone was able to then move them forward on the journey.
Yes.
Okay.
So then we're moving on to leadership lessons, which are a little bit more thinking how, as product owners, as delivery managers, and also just as decision-making team members, how can you ensure that you're leading the project and the service design in the best way? So these are, again, just a snapshot of some of the things that we've come across quite a bit, and how we've dealt with them, but also assisted our client partners in moving forward. So this one, and again, it was one when I presented it up in Edinburgh to a room full of service designers, it felt like
got a bit of a chuckle.
Yes, and felt like I was preaching to the choir. But it's important to actually state that especially if you're following what's happening within GDS and the move from digital service standards to government service standards, that whilst digital is key, we're not, the full service design, the lived experience, isn't solely on digital. No one starts and ends their journey through a service in just one channel.
Or one sitting.
Or one sitting. So from people leading projects, we're encouraging you to understand what the full lived experience is. Something that was being worked on whilst we were in first defining this is our work with Highways England, where we talk about the letters people receive, the signage, the call center experience when you get a fine and you don't know why. A more mature journey that we're doing is we worked with Innovate UK, which is an organization, a government organization that releases innovation funding into the market to grow the UK economy. And we've been working with them for about 4 years, defining key elements of quite a complex service, as you can see from this image. And this is only one snapshot of once an applicant has received funding, how do they realize those funds through the project? Who's involved? What happens offline? What happens face-to-face? What happens through a phone call? And by mapping all of that out, we were able to then define an MVP to take live into a public beta, but also to understand the complexity of the lived experience once you're in receipt of funding from the government.
Yeah, I think just to ground this kind of example, like in the middle of this slide at the moment, you can see the making a claim cycle. But I mean, this is a bit of an extreme example, but I think the thing you need to understand with innovation funding is that the people who get sponsored for innovation funding are probably brilliant individuals or companies or organizations who have a great idea. Let's say you've invented the flux capacitor, that's brilliant. But the thing is, you may not have any experience of actually running and managing a large multi-million-pound project. So in terms of this piece of service design here, you have to call out early on that the making a claim cycle or any part of this internal project setup, etc., is important, because the user base that you're dealing with may not have the experience that you believe they have.
And it demonstrates, because not every service is a straight line, and I'm sure that some people who are listening to us just now are used to getting post-it notes, drawing a straight line, understanding the start and end of a project. But in this case, this can be a 3 to 4 year making a claim cycle, where you're cycling back through the same activities every quarter. And so it isn't so much of a straight line, and you have to acknowledge that within the service.
As early
Yeah.
as possible.
Yeah, exactly. So the other, another key leadership lesson for us is to know when to challenge. So this is not just us being able to challenge our clients in presenting best practice methodology, or perhaps opinions or evidence that go contrary to perceived wisdom, but it's also giving the people we're working with the skills, the knowledge, the confidence to carry forward this idea of a friendly, non-confrontational challenge, and to understand when things are right for users. It's also, in this particular context, passing gateways becomes a bit like an exam, right? So it's like, let's prep for the exam. Let's make sure we pass a GDS gateway assessment. But actually, you have to always remember that this is a service you're designing for the users. And once you've been through the gateways, it's your users who are going to have the longest term impact. So it's balancing those two things. And this next slide is a good example. Yeah, it's a good example of this. Now that GDS is an established process, you get a pushback of, our service is only for internal users, we're exempt from GDS, or we're an arm's length body, we don't necessarily need to. However, this is the GDS Discovery Alpha Beta Live, the way they approach user-centric design processes, is a really nice framework for best practice. And just because you don't have to go through assessments doesn't mean you shouldn't be following it and shouldn't be applying some of these principles to your service design.
Yeah, and I think drawing on our experience, like we said at the beginning with all of our client bases, we've had clients that think they're exempt, and we've had clients that know they're exempt but want to follow best practice anyway. And I think that's the key thing to call out.
And we always challenge the exemption clause, because we have been down the road a couple of times where we found out quite late in a project that an assessment does need to happen and does need to schedule. So if you're following the practice, then you're not caught unawares. Okay,
so one of our third leadership lesson is helping people understand within the service design delivery that within the project basically that things have changed. You know, delivery of brilliant services doesn't occur overnight. It occurs over years, not days. And many things, as you know, without getting into politics, many things can change. Referendums can happen. New legislation can be launched. You can just enter a part of the project where you suddenly realize that actually your knowledge base that you previously had built up doesn't cover everything that you need to know. So really, for us, the successful lesson here is kind of recognizing that discovery sometimes doesn't really ever end. And actually, no matter which phase of the life cycle you may find yourself in, it's important to always be asking the question, and the successful projects, in our opinion, really are doing this, is kind of saying, okay, when do we need to go back? And for me, as I'm wearing my practitioner head, this is effectively knowing what techniques to use when. Mm-hmm. You know, you may be in a late beta stage several weeks before going live, and you could be doing a lot of lab-based research, just effectively looking for those final polishes and tweaks that you want to make to the service. But actually, if you discover something which is a fundamental risk, you may well need to go back and do a more explorative piece of work.
And we've come across it where we've come into projects at Alpha and Beta where discovery has already been done, but because of the time difference, because of a time lag, a change of staff, change of policy, or even just budgetary considerations, that some of the findings in discovery are either outdated or no longer apply, or the service or the scope of the service has changed. So looping back into discovery at those stages, even if it's rapid, even if it's just covering a few gaps, is really important. Don't just keep moving forward for the sake of moving forward.
Exactly. I mean, I think without naming the potential government organisation, we can think of one example where literally the introduction of new legislation turns that service from being relatively small to critically important overnight.
Yeah.
And actually that fundamentally meant that the project team had to stop and go, okay, where are we really?
Yes. So this one is an interesting one from our perspective. Obviously coming from an agency where we hire and work with consultants. We often have T-shaped people where they have a deep specialism, but a broader empathy and knowledge across the user-centered design disciplines. However, we acknowledge that within government organizations, especially in terms of creating cultural change, putting a strong emphasis on these disciplines, that you will get teams of user researchers, teams of content designers, teams with really deep professions and specialisms. However, we want to acknowledge that as you mature and as your organizations mature, looking for overlaps between those professions, looking for
emergent overlaps.
Also looking for empathy between the professions. So going from a place of developers not at all interested in watching what user testing is doing to them actively asking when the next round of user testing is, to understanding what's happening in research sessions and how they can apply it to their backlog and to their problem solving further down the technology line. It's the just old age adage of don't sort people into disciplines and then refuse to acknowledge evolution and emergence.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're working on a service delivery across years, which is we're typically seeing within the public sector, for us, this is a big one because we see people's behavior change. This is not necessarily about moving into a new discipline, sometimes it is, but also, it's like I think Amanda said, it's that empathy, kind of standing up for your other fellow disciplines.
Yeah.
So those are the kind of 8 lessons that we wanted to talk through today. And then when myself and Amanda first put this talk together, we kind of realized that we felt we were on the beginning of some kind of framework, really, because we feel that those 8 lessons are the ones that we see time and time again within service design within the public sector. And we asked ourselves really kind of, well, how can we make this into a useful tool that people can take away from today's session, or hopefully people took away from when we presented this in Edinburgh? Because I think the elephant in the room for us as an agency especially is that there was a piece of text within the service framework which is really critical to understand.
Yes, and so one of the key service standards is a sustainable team that can have the correct skill sets, correct seniority to make decision making. And a lot of times this is interpreted not wrongly as self-sufficiency. So one of our key goals moving into any project is to be transparent and collaborative and to provide people with the confidence to acknowledge that self-sufficiency and to understand what sustainability looks like moving forward.
So, if you're going to leave a legacy of sustainability and success for the project team, we started asking ourselves, well, what are the indicators? What are the things that we see, or the behaviors from the teams that, in our opinion, sometimes looking from the outside in, you can say, okay, well, in the long run, that piece of service design for that project is going to, or that project itself, that service will be a success, or perhaps less of a success than it could be. So we've got 7 indicators, and they're kind of built upon the lessons and built upon kind of our experience from quote unquote good and bad projects. So we're just going to kind of start going through them. This is an emergent framework. So again, at the end of today's session, we're going to be happy to take questions and thoughts. So here we go. So maturity of techniques. So with this kind of good, bad idea of projects, what we're really talking about here is project teams that are following box ticking kind of approach. And box ticking is the phrase that we're going to go with for today, that there might be kind of lip service was another expression that we thought we might use, but basically project teams which are just kind of saying they're doing it in order to try to maybe pass assessments. And the kind of indicators here of where they're just kind of box ticking, good service design will be, in our opinion, a reliance on one technique. For example, maybe they're only doing lab-based testing, and they use the phrase a lot of, oh, we're just going to validate, yes, rather than any kind of exploration.
And they might be overly reliant on quantitative data rather than getting out there and talking to users. And when we talk about tokenistic funds for research, it's not just budget, but also people. and time.
Yeah.
So not squeezing that research element of it.
So the opposite of, say, a box ticking project with their kind of maturity of techniques, if they're really affecting cultural change and embracing a service design mindset, what we tend to see is those project teams are using a broad range of appropriate techniques. And this is coming on to our earlier lesson around knowing when things have changed, knowing that actually this is okay for us to maybe do some more validative kind of laboratory type work, or actually, we need to stop and go back to discovery and do some real kind of on the ground research techniques.
And you're a real proponent, John, aren't you, of those keeping the research throughout discovery, alpha, beta, and live open-ended. So not just, is this working, is this not just a traffic light or a yes, no kind of dichotomy, but actually continue to answer those open-ended questions so you are not missing user needs.
Exactly.
So inclusive design, we're coming back onto this because we think it's really important, and it's about moving away from the types of behaviors that see a box or to see a contained area of non-standard users, or that the accessibility or inclusivity happens separate and quite late in the project.
Yeah, I mean, it's the siloing mentality. I mean, the classic mistake that those people who have been in the industry for a while will probably seen at some point is what I annoyingly call the disabled persona. And this is where you see project teams say, oh, this is Frank. Frank has dyslexia, dyspraxia, is wheelchair bound, has partial visual impairment and broke his arm playing tennis. Frank's having a really bad week. This kind of idea that disability can be put into one person as opposed to disability is something that affects everyone.
Yeah.
Or has the potential to affect it.
And when you start to see that the other side of the box ticking is what's on the cultural change scale, and it's considering inclusive design early and often, that lots of people within the organization are talking about it. It's not one lone champion. It's not pushed to a side. It's not left too late with a very small element of the budget.
I think just before we move on to the next one, actually, I just wanted to go back. Some people in today's session may be saying, what do you mean by those kinds of people? I just wanted to call this out. That is actually a quote taken in 2019 from a project where we were advocating the use of inclusivity, and the response back to us was effectively, oh, we don't need to worry about, quote unquote, those kinds of people, which I'm sure many people on today's webinar will kind of be falling off their chairs, or I hope you're falling off your chairs with such a mindset. But our point is that we still see that kind of attitude on occasion, and it's 2019.
Yeah. And also, it's another point before we move on from this slide, is that Microsoft, the Home Office, GDS are moving away from, and NHS and the NHS are moving away from acknowledging that disability, accessibility considerations are always permanent conditions, that you could have temporary conditional situations like holding a child in one hand or breaking your arm that would provide some of the same barriers that a more permanent disability would. Yeah. Speaking
as someone who's just returned from a broken back in my first day back in the office, I totally empathise with your point. Okay, willingness to change. Some of the classic examples here. So project teams that are just trying to do the box ticking, they start with that kind of mindset of, oh, it's a legacy system, we'll never change it. You notice that they're absolutely incapable of making a decision. And I think really the worst one really is when you join the project team, whatever you are, it could be a beta, alpha, discovery, wherever, you kind of ask very basic questions and don't get an answer to your basic questions. So you say things like, where's the user research? Or why did you do that?
Yeah.
And you just met with a room of shrugs.
Yeah. Another key area is decision paralysis. You might get a room full of people, but no one's making a decision to drive things forward or to put a halt and to regroup. That there's that lack of leadership, and not just leaders, but leadership. Yeah.
So obviously the counterpoint to that is teams who say that kind of what can we do with what we've got. And I think the best example for that, without explaining too much, was our RSSB example.
Yeah.
Where you know, it's this kind of, okay, if nothing else, can we change the content?
Yeah. And you get at all levels and willingness to embrace change. So you start to see conversations going, well, we've always done it that way, or we can't do it because of X, Y, and Z, to, well, what can we do? What are the quick wins? We're working on a project where we have a service design that's not going to go live for another 2.5 years. And our client partners are asking, well, what can we change on the live service? Not just what can we design for the future, but what can we change on that's currently live that will improve the service for our users right now?
So research continuity, it's similar one to the range of techniques that you might use with research, but for us, this is the one about they continue to do research throughout the life cycle. And, you know, and the teams that are failing, or in our opinion, in the longitudinal time, will struggle, are the ones that say, oh, it's done, thank you for the discovery, let's put it on a shelf and never look at it again.
Yeah, and you as I think we've said a couple of times, where you don't feel comfortable revisiting research or actually redoing research if you've acknowledged that things have changed. Another key indicator of this is that siloed working where user research, whether it is seen as the domain of those user-centered design disciplines and not of the wider team.
So obviously, as you can well imagine, the counterpoint to that, so really engaged teams where we're seeing effective cultural change, is that you see research continue throughout the life cycle of the project. And perhaps the most important one for us is right at the bottom, as GDS has been pushing for the last several years. You know, user research is a team sport, and that actually when research is occurring, it's attended by all, product owners, heads of development, delivery managers.
Yeah. It's also key, worth mentioning that you know, we're talking very much at the research and design stage, but what they're meant to do is form user needs, and they should then form part of the success criteria. So the developers should be asking, well, where are the user needs? I'm not going to address this ticket until I can trace it back to evidence. So deliverables are a key one because it is a slightly different indicator to some of the other ones we've been talking about, but we think it's an important indicator because as an agency who are often asked to come in and do a discovery or produce some alpha outcomes, what we're often being assessed and judged on are deliverables, and we're keen to make sure that deliverables form part of this cultural change, that they don't just sit on the shelf, that they're fluid. You know, one of the key things that we see with the box ticking is we've commissioned you to create 100 user stories and 6 personas and this and that and the other. And if the research and the work is pointing us in a different direction, then having that fluidity to change it.
I mean, whatever you thought you knew at the start of discovery, the whole point of a discovery program is to indicate whether that is in fact the case. Yeah. And the teams which should religiously stick to that original, can I use the word dogma? Maybe, I don't know. I just did. Will struggle. And
then the key one for me as well is that that there's so much guidance both out there in terms of blog articles, gov.uk, other organizations like ourselves who have been through this. So it's about using that guidance in a way that makes informed decisions, not following it blindly, and also applying it to the challenges and objectives of your particular service.
And finally, on this one, a really simple indicator for us, because that's what this framework is about, is simply the deliverables are visible.
Yes.
You walk into a project team's space and you know within seconds how well they're doing it because you can just tell because the walls are littered with post-it notes or personas or service maps or whatever it may be.
Yeah. So the penultimate indicator is growth of skills. So one of the things we've seen around, and this is around that self-sufficiency, sustainability, is one of the things that we've seen is that we often come into services where user-centered design disciplines don't exist, and by the end of it, they've got a small emerging team. But if they're not supported, if they're not given the chance to grow their skills and to work on the service, then we could see those small emerging teams not flourish.
Yeah, I mean, die on the vine is perhaps a harsh phrase, but really, if you're trying to affect successful changes, remember, not every organisation within government thinks in this kind of way. So the counterpoint to that, though, is, and perhaps the most important piece here, Amanda will come back to the T-shaped comment before, but for me, we have to acknowledge the power of the product owner.
Yeah.
Because in these kind of cultural change examples, when you are growing and developing these small disciplines, perhaps you've got 1, 2, 3 user researchers, perhaps 1 content designer within that service. It is the product owner that can really absolutely make or break those smaller discipline sets. Because let's face it, traditionally within government, there's probably a lot of developers on the project because the ratio of developers to other disciplines typically is high. But it's the product owners who have the ability to make those teams succeed.
Yes, and so to come back to T-shapes, again, we're not suggesting that you go in search of a unicorn or a particular kind of practitioner who can content design, do user research, do interaction design, do visual design. That's not what we're saying here. It's more of making those deep disciplines, those key professionals, you're recognizing emergence. So they're asking the right questions. Has this been through a content designer, or should we get a content designer to look at this? Has it been validated by the user? The developers are talking about it.
That's the ultimate one, isn't it? We talk about this a lot. The moment you get a developer push back on a ticket within Jira and say, I'm not working on that yet because I can't see the user need, or how have we arrived at this point, then you know you're onto a winner.
And it's all the disciplines understanding how they work together, how they join up, and where their overlap is. Because if you do get a couple of disciplines with a good overlap, you could work in a power of 2 and speed up some of those kind of research design or content design and interaction design phases of work, because they're working together at a velocity.
So the last one. Okay, so responsibilities. This is more of a cultural problem in general, right? But what we see is for successful organizations embracing service design, there's a culture of blame or not my job mentality, or UX or user research, is blocking development. Is it really?
Yeah.
You know, why is that? Why are you saying that?
And also, you know, because no one's taking responsibility, things do not get resolved quite quickly. So sometimes you do need someone to stand up and kind of take responsibility and make a decision.
So, I mean, as you can well imagine, the kind of complete counterpoint to this is the successful teams. You know, you walk in and you have a conversation with the team, and you actually struggle to figure out whose job role is what.
Mm-hmm. And that there is that collective decision-making, that shared problem solving. You still need somebody like the product owner or a decision maker if there's multiple opinions in a room. But by acknowledging those opinions, you can acknowledge that responsibilities are a little bit more fluid. So, thank you very much. That's our indicators of the framework. Jon and I are still, we kind of revisited this after our first presentation of it, and the way we talk about it, the way we position it is still evolving, and so we're, either now or through Twitter, keen to hear your opinions of it. I think we've got a couple more slides.
Yeah, and I think what we've really tried to talk about here is to give you some practical tips, and we keep using this phrase indicators to help you keep an eye on perhaps the projects that you're working on.
Yeah.
And really what we're trying to get to is that ultimately you're trying to leave a legacy of user-centered cultural change in the services that we design. But where we see project teams within the public sector really, really thriving, particularly if you work within the UK and with GDS and the framework that we work to, is what we really ultimately got to today, and hopefully you've got this message, is stop trying to pass the assessments, just focus on delivering a great service. Project teams that are just obsessed with passing assessments, they're not doing a great they're not as successful. I mean, the analogy myself and Amanda have used several times is a bit like when people are at school and they revise enough to try to pass the exam, whereas you get other individuals who actually understand the content that they're doing, so that when they pass the exam, they're just really good at what they do.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So have there been any questions that have come through? I think a lot of...
Just checking some questions that have come through.
I think there's been some connectivity issues, but I don't think there are any questions on the content.
No, there's none on Twitter either.
Okay. Well, we'll take that as a good sign.
Yeah, no news is good news.
But as we've left you with both our Twitter handles, and obviously we will be continuing to monitor the We Are Nomensa feed as well. And feel free to reach out after this if you do have any questions. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.